Hi everyone, welcome to this edition of the Personal Finance Playbook. I'm your host, Jack Wang of Longhorn Financial. The college search process. While it can be exciting, it is often exciting as in stressful for students and parents alike. What school will give them the best chance of success? What will they like? What's the right fit? And of course, what school offers the most aid? Often these questions are answered by the parents with the phrase, "I heard that." Well, instead of conjecture, today's special guest will offer insight into this process of helping your student find the school where they will thrive academically, personally, and socially. Joining me today is my good friend Tom O'Hare, College Advisor of Get College Going. He's also an educational loan consultant for AAA Northeast. Now, due to some technical difficulties we had when we originally taped the show, we lost the first few minutes in the beginning. But there's so much demand for this information that I want to still use the parts that we got, which fortunately was most of the show. So we join in with Tom where he's answering the question of when you should start the college search process.
I think it's critical, Jack, that students visit schools, especially in the latter stage of their sophomore year and especially going into the fall of their junior year. There's no other way to really get the feel of an institution, to see if you fit into the campus, to see if you really have the same vibe as the students do by visiting. You can get all the mail and all the view books, but you're not really going to get the touch of the institution without visiting the school. I think that going to probably 3 to 4 visits during that span of time, and even going back maybe when you're a senior to revisit schools that you're really hot on, is critical.
You're talking about 3 to 4 visits each school, right? That you think you're really interested in, right?
Yeah, as you narrow down your list from your search, from a broad to a narrow, those narrow schools are the ones you're really going to start visiting hard. But in your sophomore year, especially going into this time of the year, when you're going into vacation times, a student who is a sophomore, going to be a rising junior, has never been to a college campus, may not have any relatives or friends that have gone to campuses, it's a great time to go and just walk the campus. See what the size of a college really is in comparison to your high school. Maybe it's double, maybe it's triple, maybe you eventually will learn that you want a smaller school or a similar school. So visiting the campuses is very important.
And I know we were speaking off camera about this, but you also talked about the notion of distance, right? If a student is looking for a school that's really far. So share with our viewers a little bit on that. What if a student wants to go distance?
Distance is critical from the standpoint of deciding. I usually say to students and families, where did you go and spend your last vacation? Have you gone to camp and gone away by yourself, and how far away was it? Do you really know the distance of 2 hours versus 5 hours, and would you feel comfortable being that far away? I always hope that students are going to go to school and only come home during holidays. So if you go a distance and you want to be coming home on the weekend, you may be in trouble. So finding out, that down East Maine is 6 hours from here, or the Mid-Atlantic of the country is 6 hours from here, is important to find out early, especially while you're going through the search process.
Right, and kids don't always have a sort of an understanding or perspective on that, right? So let's fast forward a little bit. So let's say that the student has identified a number of schools and now wants to really get the college applications in. What's the right number for a student to apply to today? I think, in my impression, it's actually higher than maybe when you and I went through the process, but what's the right number for kids today?
Well, of course, that answer is there isn't really the right number. The right number from my perspective is the number of institutions that are going to give the student the greatest options and choices. So if you start with a list of 50 schools and you narrow it down, you may narrow it down to 10 or 12 schools. And those schools are going to fit into various categories based on selectivity of the school, based on whether they fit the student's match, and hopefully they do as they do a good search. But it's really trying to find out those institutions that meet the student's academic, their personal, and even some of their extracurriculum profiles.
Okay. Now, let's talk about admissions, right? So you've identified the schools. You know that your student wants to apply to these 10 or 12, like you said. one of the things that causes the most amount of stress is, of course, standardized tests, SATs, ACTs. But yet, a number of schools today don't require it, or as far as I know. What's your take on standardized tests? How much do schools really look at it? How important is it really?
Tests are important. They are represented probably a third of the student's academic profile coming out of their high school. But there's a little bit of some misnomer about what's going on with the testing. There are probably over 400 or 500 schools that are continuously advertising the fact that they are test optional. You do not need the test, which is referred to as the SAT or the ACT, for admissions. And that's fine. They're going to go based on the individual's academic profile, the rigor of the high school, their GPA, and their rank. But in order to receive scholarship money, those same schools may use the SAT or the ACT test for qualification for scholarship money. So it's important that the individuals know the school's qualifications for admissions as well as scholarship awarding as they start thinking about taking the test. I do recommend that a student take at least one of the tests at least once. So it shows their balance of their academic makeup, their profile, to allow the school to see maybe they are a strong GPA and they're a strong test taker. Or maybe they're not a strong SAT or ACT test taker, but their GPA is strong. So, and a lot of that can also be explained when they write their essay.
So now, you brought up a great point that I'm not sure that our viewers or many of our viewers recognize. You brought up about the test optional schools where you don't need the SAT or ACT to get in, but if you don't take it, they might unintentionally keep themselves from getting some aid, some scholarships or things, right?
Right. Especially selective schools who do a fairly amount of rewarding of students for their overall academic and personal profile. They're going to require the test. So it's important to understand the guidelines so in fact you can plan accordingly. Students should consider taking them if they're going to be looking for scholarship money.
Okay, and of course, you brought up the whole notion of, well, what if my student's not a good test taker? After all, it can be very stressful. You're sitting in a room for 3 hours, can't look at this, can't look at that, and it's dead silence, which would just drive me bananas. What about those students? What do you recommend? And what's your take on the test prep type of services?
Well, for students who are strugglers at taking tests, and I always was, and continue to be, even if it's a driving test, you have to maybe learn how to relax. So a high school prep program that's usually given in the senior year is a great example of a way in which a student can learn how to take the test. It's not necessarily going to improve their academic or going to bump their score by 400 or 500 points, but it's going to allow them to at least relax during the fact that they're taking the test. Learn how to do stress reduction exercises, breathe, how many pencils to bring and a bottle of water so that they're well prepared. Stress is a result of not knowing what's going to happen to you. As far as prep programs, I think they're good for students who need that academic extra training, that extra education, but I would recommend that they start in their sophomore year and continuing through their sophomore, junior, and senior year. Personally, I don't see a major improvement in a student's test score by doing a prep program for 3 weeks in their senior year. They may bring it up 50 points, but that's not necessarily going to gain them a larger scholarship or an acceptance into a different type of school.
Okay, so even with that, you want to prepare. So it doesn't necessarily pay off if you're cramming, right, for that. Right. So now you also brought up talking about the application, the overall profile, the essay. I know Common Application today requires an essay. What role does the essay really play, and how important is it really for the schools to look at?
I think it's very important in today's day and age where so much of the application process is done online and through virtual data submission. If a student hasn't met an admissions counselor, has not visited a school and had a conversation, and I'm not talking about an interview, but just an opportunity to introduce themselves and raise their hand and show interest in a particular school, then the essay is going to be a critical element. I consider it to be a story. It's a story about the individual student. It's their opportunity to express some of their passions, some of their interest, what has shaped them behaviorally, what has shaped them as an individual over the course of their, young life. And it gives the admissions person an opportunity to read about the student from a different perspective. So it's very important.
Okay. You did also mention sort of meeting with admissions people. I know schools will bring in folks for college day or a table event. There's certainly college fairs around the area that families and students and schools will attend. But what do you recommend in terms of meeting? And remember, and I know you said that it's not necessarily about the interview, but how important is that process? Should you, even when you go on a tour, should you always make sure you maybe spend a little one-on-one time with the admissions person? Or just talk to our viewers a little bit, sort of some good tips are around that.
Anytime a student can demonstrate interest in the institution, it's critical. So if an admissions person, again, you're the admissions counselor, I'm the student. You don't know me for Adam in comparison to another 100 students or 200 students that might be interested in going to a particular school. So I'm a proponent of individuals marketing themselves, whether it's through their profile, their academic criteria, their information that they can show through the computer and the application process. The essay is the other part. And I think any opportunity for a student to be able to introduce themselves, start a conversation with an admissions counselor is important. Schools have representatives that cover territory. So everybody that's coming into Westford High School or Neshoba Valley, they're coming from schools and they're responsible for that territory. Students need to take the time to introduce themselves and get to know them. And then, as you said, if they go on campus for a tour, and they can prearrange by emailing the admissions counselor that they've met that they're going to be there, they don't want to stop by and spend a whole, 3 hours meeting with them, but they want to just pop in and say, hey, I'm here on campus, I'm going through a tour. Don't forget about me when you see my application come across.
Right. Just kind of sort of stay in front of that person, kind of, put a name with a face with a name, as it were. Right, okay, that makes sense. Another part of the application, of course, is the transcript. And here's a question that I often get from parents, and I can't really answer this because this isn't my area. But parents, especially those families in the, say, upper income towns or, the better rated school districts, I often hear, well, but I heard that our kids in this town get the blah, 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 like the town bump, right? Because hey, we're a good school district. How true is that? Does that actually happen? Does it not happen? I mean, I can't really comment because, quite frankly, I have no idea. But I'll hear people say, well, because I live in this town and my kid's going to graduate from the town high school, we're going to automatically get a little bump as a result of that.
Well, I think there may be some truth to that depending upon the college or university. There are ways in which schools can build into their database information, intelligence about the high school and the rigor of the school. But I think it runs the gamut from urban cities and towns that have strong students that are coming out, strong middle school students that have gone into high school, to, quote unquote, affluent communities that could be producing the same type of student. I think it's important. It's a question that can be asked when you go on a tour or you go to an information session. And when you're, viewing the individual who's answering the question, you're looking at their body language and how they're answering the question. So you can find out if, there's truth behind it. I think that it causes more distraction. I think it causes more stress and anguish on behalf of the parents. They'd be better off putting their emphasis on, making sure that the student broadens themselves academically and personally, so that they could sit here, and be interviewed by you through the program. So it's all about the student, and I think there's too much hype sometimes in some of the things that people read and hear about.
Well, I suppose that's it's interesting you say that. Spend the time sort of improving the student, improving the profile, because after all, if it's true that students of a high school get a bump, then wouldn't it be true that theoretically all students of that high school get that
Sure.
bump? And you certainly could have multiple students applying to the same school, and you're trying to differentiate yourself.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, most definitely. And you have to be, you have to be honest to yourself. I think when you're looking at some of those ranking things that come out, whether it's Boston Magazine or USA Today, and they're ranking cities and towns, what's the ultimate desire behind it? What's the ulterior motive behind the way that some of these cities and towns are ranked? I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about that. I don't spend a lot of time looking for that to influence the conversations I have with parents and students. I want the student to find the right place for them to be able to go. So I think that's the important thing.
Okay. Now, what about this as part of the application process? Also, oftentimes there are recommendations that are needed. So what role do these really play, and what tips can you offer families about maybe approaching a teachers, or anybody else for recommendation?
Next to your parents and some close relatives, you spend a lion part of your life. Students spend a lion's share of their life with their teachers, especially those that they develop a good relationship and kinship with from their 9th grade on. So the recommendation can be helpful for the admissions person to read a different slant, a different opinion, a different perspective on a particular student. It can be from a teacher, it can be from a coach, it can be from someone in your religious community, someone who you've been involved in a volunteer program, but it's important to help the school get that wide breadth. See, the schools are looking to see if the student is going to fit into their institution and what they're going to bring to the school to help the college and university improve. So along with diversity, when you talk about diversity, you're talking about students who are bringing a different swagger, if that word is still used, but a different swagger onto the campus to help the campus grow itself.
Okay, interesting. So now all of these things are, your student has identified the dozen or so schools. You've taken the test, you've gotten the recommendations, you've gotten good grades, by virtue of your GPA. Now it's time to send it in. But schools will have different types of application cycles. There's sort of early admission, or early decision, early admissions 1, early admissions 2, regular cycle. So share with our viewers a little bit about sort of what those mean generally, and if you have any tips on what a student should go for.
So there's 3 general ones, and even myself, I miss them up once in a while. But there's early decision, early action, and regular admissions. And the idea with the earlies is to either lock into a binding agreement with one institution through early decision. Student really knows where they want to go. They've done their search. Their heart is set on this institution. Then they're going to apply to just one. And when they apply under that program, they're agreeing not to apply to any other institutions until they hear from that school. Early action is that they can apply to multiple institutions and hear early in the process. And this generally is getting your application in October so you can hear back from the school in November. And then rolling admissions runs anytime up until, in some cases, February, middle part of February for students that are looking to go to school. So you really have to take a hard look at, how soon you want to get it in. Are you willing to accept the answer that you may receive, and what your options are, that you're laying for it. The other part of it is if you're applying to one school, then you have to be willing to accept their financial offer and the affordability of that institution. So there's some good homework that needs to go into that. Otherwise, if you're not accepted at the school you want to go to, or you don't want to go to that institution as part of that early process, then you're starting behind the 8 ball in some cases.
Right, so early decision where you're committing to that school if they accept you, but that's for kids who absolutely know, hey, mom, dad, I definitely want to go here, right? They really have to have their heart set. They can't be waffling and go early decision because it doesn't allow for that.
Yeah, I think the makeup of the individual, you can tell that individual, that student, pretty closely from the standpoint of if you were to meet that individual, they're probably a pretty mature student. They've developed themselves academically and personally very strongly. They carry themselves very well. They're prepared, and they have the They have the profile that the school is looking for. And they may also be in a family that can afford to send the student to school there too.
Okay, so let's talk costs for a little bit. I know, I have a number of conversations with families about aid and finances, but share with our audience a little bit just sort of how does merit aid work? I know it's a little bit different each school, but general rules of thumb around merit aid.
General rule of thumb is merit aid is rewarding the individual for who they are, for their academic profile, for their personal characteristic, for maybe their athletic ability, maybe their performing arts ability, maybe their dance, depending upon where they're going to go. So it's really rewarding the student for who they are and what they can potentially bring to the school.
Okay, and of course the better the school sees the student as being a match, right, then that means generally they might get more money. It's not necessarily that you have to be the absolute best student at whatever school. It's really, like you talked about, sort of, can that student offer the school something as well? And the better you're able to answer that, then oftentimes you get more money, correct?
Yeah, I think it's part of the admissions dance.
Right.
It's the admissions dance in the sense that, and that's why I'm very adamant about students demonstrating interest in schools, not the parents, but the student being the one that's advocating for themselves by demonstrating interest in that school so that the school can see that this is a potential individual that we want. So we want should also equate to the word recruitment, right? Recruitment is generally set aside for the athletic side of the world, but there is some sense of thinking about recruitment from an academic standpoint. So merit money is a way in which rewarding students who have performed well, make the match. We want that student in our school, so they're going to be able to be awarded potential scholarship money. It may range in dollar value. It may be in an isolated situation, a full tuition ride, but in many instances, it's a percentage of the cost to go to school there.
Right, and so as much as students want to sell themselves to the school, but what you're saying is that the schools are also selling themselves to the student, right, to a certain extent, right, to find that right match and things.
I would hope that they would position themselves that way, yeah. They want to recruit the student, and one way to do that is to show through a monetary reward that we're interested in you coming to us, so we're going to award you the presidential scholarship to come here. Now there's some others that the school administers too that are more alumni based that the student might have to apply for, but merit money is free money and it's based on the student. It's not based on need like the financial aid process.
All right. Just very briefly, time for one last very quick question. One last tip for our audience of a common mistake to avoid or a quick tip. Go.
I think the common thing, one of the most important things is between the student and the parents, level expectations. Have a strong conversation, and it can be at that 9th grade when you're first coming in or 10th grade when you're moving along. Expectations on where you're going to be successful. Will you be successful at Harvard? Will you be successful at Merrimack? Will you be successful at Embry-Riddle down in Florida? And the financial side of it, the affordability side of it. Mom and dad, be honest with sons and daughters about how much you have saved to be able to pay. This time of year right now, families are getting their acceptance financial aids, they've made the decisions, and the last thing that a family wants is a son or daughter who's in tears because they got into the school that they really, really wanted to go to, but they can't afford to go.
Well, I mean, this is some great information, and I want to say thank you to our special guest today, Tom O'Hare of Get College Going and AAA Northeast. This topic could span hours. There's so much to it, but that's all the time we have for today. Join us next time when we take another topic out of the Personal Finance Playbook.